Hi, my name is Jia, and today I will be talking about a series of experiments that deal with visualizing census data for personal consumption. What all these have in common is that they experiment with visual communication in order to contextualize or ground the often abstract, opaque, and impersonal statistical view of the census. The first of these started a few years ago and is an explorer to view census data through satellite images. Here is one of the results of the explorer. In this image, satellite images of census tracts are filtered and sorted by the percentage of population of a particular race. We get this very general, but also very tangible and immediate impression that conveys the landscapes that groups of populations reside in. Here in another result from the initial Census Explorer, this image of two census data points that are combined to compare and contrast areas. On the left here are high percentages of residents over 85 years of age, which can be very different from the right, where we're filtering tracts by age, but also looking through the lens of economics. These images worked to a certain extent to communicate what the census was measuring and what a place with a particular census characteristic looks like. However, these stayed very general. And so a second series of experiments emerged from the other end of the spectrum in terms of scale. Rather than using just the census statistics, we added personal location to the next maps. At the time, just over a year ago, leaky apps that tracked individuals were already extremely problematic. They were profiling individuals with extreme detail, and to mirror this process, I was able to obtain the coordinates of a person's phone over the course of 4 years. This data was obtained through a public data project called OpenPath, which unfortunately no longer exists. The data I obtained contained a pair of coordinates and the timestamps that are related to each coordinate. This data looks like this geographically without a base map to give you an idea of the patterns of travel. These coordinates represent 899 days of one person's travels. There are more than 20,000 records here, and they represent time spent in 2,633 unique census tracts. From there, I singled out the tracts that this person spent the most time in, and further narrowed down to these 9 tracts that the individual spent more than 50% of their time in. And to formulate a visual argument, these tracts were assembled into this hypothetical island where the person lives for most of their time. Here, I made a series of comparisons between the demographics and census statistics of this island of one and the rest of the country. And in general, we can make a profile of this person by combining their location data with the census data of that location. From here, more interesting questions emerged, such as where is this person never at but very close to? What is just outside the boundaries of this island? And what are the demographics of that composite place that's just out of reach? For the previous experiment, I spent time looking into the idea of creating a traditional census atlas for one person. However, as the project developed, it became more clear that as an artifact, it's very hard to replicate and it would serve as more of a demonstration tool. What would be interesting, rather, is to add a point of entry for personal experiments through geolocation when using satellite images to convey census data. And so over the past summer, we started to work with satellite images again by building some stories in them. Somewhat parallel to this was an ongoing project we had at the center that previous year in collaboration with a public health team to produce COVID-related maps. In those maps, we used the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index as one of our metrics for allocating healthcare workers and vaccines. The Social Vulnerability Index, or SVI, uses 15 census data points as vulnerability indicators and calculates the percentages of people or residences at high risk as percentiles that are then added to create a composite score for overall vulnerability. The first thing we built to explore the idea of explaining this index was a calculator. Then following this explanatory approach, we built a second interface where users can come to choose their own definitions for the index by checking and unchecking the existing criteria for vulnerability and see the results reflected on the map. What we found here is that vulnerability scores are very interesting because they're composite scores that cover just a bit of everything. The total vulnerability calculations leverages these indicators so that the entire country can be put in some sort of order in terms of vulnerability. We're all vulnerable in very different ways, so not all indicators are equally meaningful across different places when we narrow down the data for a smaller geography. What it does instead, though, is that when a given indicator for a place doesn't quite fit the place it's measuring, it kind of exposes what underlies this definition and our thinking around vulnerability, and gives us an opportunity to think about these metrics and what cannot be measured. For example, in New York City, we have only a very few tracts here with a high percentage of mobile homes. So the majority of areas will have an identical score for this particular indicator, which accounts for the rather consistent dent on the left side of the radar chart here across all tracts of the city. But we do have very high rates of residences inside large buildings because of the density. And these are not necessarily indicators of vulnerability in the traditional sense, because housing structures with more than 10 units are not only very common, but also exist especially at both ends of the economic spectrum. In the city, the Midtown area, as well as the financial district, has residents with the highest per capita income and highest density. And because the density of the city is reduced when it radiates out, we have a very different pattern here than we would other places with a different orientation. We can see here, as we first saw in the maps in the previous slide, the income of areas with high concentrations of large residential buildings cover the lowest income areas as well as the highest. Here, number 4 on the slide, tract 267 in Washington Heights has some of the lowest income in the city, while number 9 and number 10 in Midtown South have some of the highest. To get a basic understanding of these and to display them more easily, we built a simple interface that lists the tracts in order for a particular criteria, but by adding this drop-down for each indicator and also 2 buttons to sort the order. In looking at this, it struck us that an interesting connection can be made between tracts that share a particular characteristic but are very different in other respects. So we followed up this interface with a second set of images called Same But Different. This is an interface that presents pairs of tracts that share identical percentages for a single criteria but are different in all other ways. We did this simply by charting the overall SVI difference against the single SVI metric difference between a given pair of census tracts, and then sorting the pairs by those that have the greatest overall difference and the least individual metric difference. Here is another example of a very different pair of places that share large residential buildings. And here are 2 tracts that show that the rate of poverty, because they're identical, could mean very different things. Here's another asymmetric poverty rate pair. On the right here, we see the difference in income and unemployment are particularly striking. However, per capita income happens to be an outlier in these charts. Pairs of tracts with similar per capita income represents asymmetry in other indicators. But in education, we again see very different places. And children and elderly live very differently in the city, as we showed in an earlier iteration filtering for high percentages of populations over 85, communities here are very different but share this composition of the elderly. And of course, not having access to a car means very different things in a city. And we find that both, again, in the areas of Midtown with high income as well as other areas of high concentration, not having access to a car means very different things. As these pairs emerged, I started to see how these metrics measure and doesn't measure vulnerability. But more importantly, these metrics are drawing connections between places through the data. And of course, these SVI measures come from the census ACIs, so we could be able to expand the ways we compare and contrast these measures as well as work with other locations. These images, I feel, are starting to build an entry point to this monolithic data set that is very specific and could potentially be highly personal. So currently what we're doing is starting to go back to the idea of how a person might approach this first approach this complex data set. And we started with just one person again, this time entering their address or a set of coordinates or a series of coordinates and getting to explore census data in the way that I've demonstrated in the images in the previous slides. They're able to contextualize census data of their locations and their past locations with images, comparisons, and connections. Thank you for listening. These last maps are in progress very much. They're very much an open conversation with an open invitation to comment, so I welcome your suggestions and ideas. Thank you so much for having me.